Imperial history is built upon the myths of glorious battles and heroic charges, narratives polished to adorn the annals of power. But there are episodes that refuse to fit this mold, moments so humiliating they are relegated to footnotes or disguised as mere tactical setbacks. January 1779 offers us one such uncomfortable phantom. An expeditionary force of the British East India Company, the armed wing of a nascent empire that considered itself invincible, was surrounded, strangled, and forced into unconditional surrender without even fighting a pitched battle worthy of the name. Official history, written with the quill of shame, calls it a disastrous retreat. The truth, however, is far more precise, far more brilliant, and infinitely more humiliating. This is not the story of a battle. It is the anatomy of a perfect trap. Our title suggests a massacre. 9,000 valiant men annihilating 50,000 invaders. But the first casualty in war is truth, and here the myth is twofold. The British force was not 50,000 strong, but barely 4,000. And their defeat was not the product of overwhelming numbers, but of an imperial arrogance so profound it bordered on pathological blindness. This is not a tale of brute force, but of strategic brilliance. The architect of this catastrophe, the Maratha general Mahaji Shinde, did not seek to defeat the British on the battlefield. His aim was to dismantle them piece by piece, psychologically and logistically. He used their own strengths, their discipline, their faith in technology, and their disdain for the enemy as the levers for their destruction. He turned the terrain into a weapon, and British arrogance into his deadliest ammunition. Prepare to deconstruct a legend. We will strip this event of its heroic rhetoric and examine it under the cold light of strategy. The annihilation at Wadgaon is not a simple episode of the First Anglo-Maratha War. It is a case study in how a seemingly inferior power can exploit the systemic weaknesses of a giant. It is the story of how an army was defeated not by the sword, but by hunger, thirst, misinformation, and psychological terror. Forget the cavalry charges and artillery duels. The real battle was fought in the minds of the British commanders, a war they had already lost weeks before the first significant shot was fired. This is the chronicle of how an empire was brought to its knees, not by an army, but by an idea. In the Maratha corner, we find not a bejeweled warrior king, but a strategist of the shadows, Mahaji Shinde. His genius lay not in the frontal assault, but in the predator's patience. He was a master of psychological warfare, a consummate practitioner of Ganami Kava, the Maratha art of guerrilla warfare that translates to like striking and fleeing. He understood the British psyche better than the British themselves. He knew their dependence on logistics, their blind faith in the discipline of fire lines, and their cultural arrogance. He did not seek the glory of a decisive battle. He sought total victory through the enemy's systemic collapse. While the British prepared for a duel of honor by European rules, Shinde was weaving a spider's web, transforming his homeland's landscape into a deadly labyrinth from which there would be no escape. His goal was not to kill soldiers, it was to annihilate an army. Shinde's instrument was not a hammer, but a swarm. The Maratha army was a vast and fluid force, composed mainly of tens of thousands of light cavalry horsemen. These were not the heavy cuirassiers of Europe, designed to break infantry formations. They were hornets, born in the saddle, capable of covering vast distances, striking from unexpected angles, and vanishing before the enemy could respond. Supported by irregular infantry and functional artillery, their true strength lay not in their firepower, but in their speed, their intimate knowledge of the terrain, and their ability to live off the land. Their motivation was pure and primal, to defend their capital, Pune, and protect the sovereignty of the Maratha Empire from the insatiable expansion of the company. They were the immune system of their land, and the British army was the invading virus. On the other side of the board, the imperial giant. The British expedition was nominally under the command of Colonel William Cockburn, an officer whose faith in European discipline and the power of Brown Bess muskets was absolute and unwavering. However, true authority rested with a civilian committee in Bombay, indecisive and riddled with internal disputes. This fractured command structure created a two-headed monster, one militarily rigid, the other politically hesitant. The mindset pervading the entire expedition was one of almost casual disdain for their adversary. They firmly believed that the Marathas, upon seeing their immaculate red lines and hearing the roar of their artillery, would be forced to fight a conventional battle. This assumption, born of arrogance and ignorance, was not just a miscalculation. It was the fatal flaw upon which Shinda would build his entire strategy. The British force was a formidable war machine, but one designed for a specific type of conflict. Around 4,000 men, including a corps of 600 European soldiers, the pinnacle of 18th century line infantry. They were equipped with superior artillery and trained for a war of attrition in open country, where their fire discipline could annihilate any less organized foe. But their strength was also their weakness. They marched slowly, dragging a colossal baggage train, tents, servants, cattle, and supplies for weeks. This supply line was their umbilical cord and their Achilles heel, utterly oblivious to the kind of war that awaited them. They believed their slow, methodical advance was a demonstration of power. In reality, they were turning themselves into a slow, predictable, and exquisitely vulnerable target, offering Mahaji Shinda the perfect objective for a death by 1,000 cuts. The stage is set. The three-dimensional chessboard of the Western Ghats awaits its pieces. The British decision, a monument to hubris, has already been made. Instead of a swift, bold advance, they opted for a snail-paced crawl, an almost funereal procession. They halted for weeks at the foothills of the Bor Ghat, investing precious time not in securing their flanks or sending out effective scouts, but in building a road to drag their heavy artillery and their gigantic baggage train, convinced they were taming the wild Indian landscape. Every stone moved, every tree felled, was not a sign of progress, but another beat in the symphony of their own destruction. Mahaji Shinde watched, patient, allowing the giant to venture deeper and deeper into the jaws of his self-imposed, meticulously constructed trap. The British column finally gets underway, a serpent of red coats and ox carts slithering slowly into the heart of enemy territory. The air, once filled with the arrogant confidence of an imperial power, begins to thin. The narrow defiles and dense vegetation no longer seem like mere obstacles, but a death corridor watching in silence. The first Maratha horsemen appear and disappear on the hill crests like phantoms, specters that do not attack but herald an impending doom. The trap is about to spring. We are about to witness the dissection of a disaster, the dismantling of a myth, blow by blow. To ensure you don't miss how this masterpiece of strategic annihilation unfolds, join our legion of historians by subscribing and turning on notifications. You won't want to miss the exact moment the jaws of the trap finally snap shut. Once the head of the British column enters the Bor Ghat, the very nature of the conflict transforms. The advance, already glacial, becomes an agony. There is no defined battlefront, no enemy to face in an orderly line. Instead, the Maratha army manifests as an elemental force, a ghost that rides the wind. Mahaji Shinde's horsemen appear on the hilltops, silhouettes against the sky, only to vanish before the artillery can even take aim. They do not seek a direct engagement. That would be playing by British rules. Instead, they begin the first phase of the plan, the bleeding. The war does not begin with a charge, but with 1,000 paper cuts, each designed to demoralize, weaken, and isolate the giant that has entered their lair. The tactic of Genemi Kava is unleashed in all its lethal efficiency. Small groups of cavalry, 50 to 100 riders, emerge from the forests and ravines. Their targets are not the infantry battalions, but the army's vital arteries, the supply convoys, the foraging parties, the lone messengers, and the vulnerable rearguard. They strike with dizzying speed, hurling javelins and firing their muskets from the saddle, then retreating into the safety of the terrain they know like the back of their hand. For the British soldiers, it is a nightmare. They cannot form a defensive square against an enemy that will not stay to fight. Every shot from a distant hill, every war cry echoing through the valleys, ratchets up the tension. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere at once. The impact is primarily psychological. Morale, so high at the start of the expedition, begins to crack under the constant pressure. Nights are broken by false alarms and lightning raids that prevent rest. The days are a tense march under a scorching sun, with the constant threat of ambush around every bend. The officers, trained for Napoleonic warfare, find themselves helpless, their tactical rulebook utterly useless in this environment. Initial arrogance evaporates, replaced by a corrosive paranoia. Mahaji Shinde is not fighting an army. He is conducting a psychological dissection, severing the nerves of confidence and discipline one by one. The invincible British lion is being bled by a swarm of mosquitoes before it has even had a chance to roar. After an infernal march that seems to last an eternity, the exhausted British column finally sights its intermediate objective, Talagaon. In their minds, this town represents salvation. It is the promised resupply point, a sanctuary where they can rest, find food and fodder for their animals, and regroup before the final assault on Pune. The anticipation is palpable. Every soldier, from the colonel to the last sepoy, dreams of fresh water and full rations. The sight of Talagaon in the distance is a mirage of hope in a desert of hostility. They believe they have overcome the worst, that the nightmare of the Ghats is over. They could not be more wrong. The nightmare, in fact, is just about to begin, for they are not heading towards a refuge, but into the exact center of the trap. Upon reaching the outskirts of the town, the mirage of hope shatters into a nightmarish vision. Talagaon is not an oasis of supplies. It is a funeral pyre. Mahaji Shinde has implemented a scorched earth policy with methodical cruelty. The entire town has been set ablaze, the granaries are smoldering husks, the croplands have been burned to the ground, and, the masterstroke, the water wells have been poisoned with carrion. Nothing is left. Not a stalk of grain, not a drop of potable water. It is an act of total war that strikes the British with the force of a battering ram. Shinde's message is unequivocal and brutal. Every step you take in my land takes you further from life. Here you will find nothing but death. This is the moment the strategic trap snaps shut. The British army is now stranded in the heart of enemy territory, dozens of miles from its nearest base, without food, without water, and completely surrounded by a hostile force that controls every inch of the terrain. Their arrogance made them believe that sustenance would simply appear, that the land would bend to their needs as the peoples they conquered did. Shinde has shown them that the land itself is their most formidable enemy. They are no longer an army of conquest. They are a group of desperate, isolated men. The initiative has passed entirely to the Marathas. The hunter has officially become the prey, and the cage has just been locked with an echo of ash and despair. Panic blooms in the British camp. The facade of discipline and superiority crumbles, revealing a terrified leadership committee and a military commander overwhelmed by events. Accusations fly back and forth. The reality of their situation is inescapable. To advance on Pune is suicide. To remain in Talagaon is to starve. The only option, however humiliating, is retreat. The desperate decision is made to begin a nighttime withdrawal to the village of Wadgaon, hoping the darkness will provide the necessary cover to escape. They do not realize that this decision is not their own. It is exactly what Mahaji Shinde expected them to do. The retreat is not an escape. It is the final, bloodiest phase of his meticulous plan. They are willingly walking into the jaws of annihilation. The retreat begins at midnight, not as an orderly tactical maneuver, but as a chaotic flight. The darkness, far from being an ally, becomes a multiplier of terror. The Maratha forces, which had previously contented themselves with harassment, now go for the jugular. The assault is total and from all directions. Rockets hiss through the night, illuminating scenes of panic and confusion. Cavalry charges the flanks of the disorganized column, while Maratha infantry takes up ambush positions along the escape route. British discipline, forged on the battlefields of Europe, disintegrates. The retreating column ceases to be a military formation and becomes a moving slaughterhouse, a perfect target for an enemy who knows every shadow and every path. The journey to Wadgan becomes a descent into hell. Control is completely lost. The heavy cannons, the pride of the expedition, and the main reason for its slow advance, become leaden anchors. They are abandoned in the mud, a potent symbol of British technological impotence in the face of superior strategy. Desperate soldiers throw away their equipment to move faster. The column fragments into small groups of survivors who are hunted down one by one in the darkness. The Ganimi Kava has given way to a direct slaughter. Shinde is no longer interested in bleeding the enemy. He is now dismembering it, ensuring that the remnants that reach Wadgaon are so shattered, physically and morally, that surrender is their only logical conclusion. The battered and terrified remnants of the British force finally stumble into Wadgaon at dawn. But the village offers no salvation. It is merely a more exposed killing ground. Exhausted, hungry, thirsty, and with their ammunition almost depleted, they attempt to establish a desperate defensive perimeter. They have barely begun to dig trenches when the true scope of Shinda's genius becomes apparent. The brief relief of having reached a destination evaporates as they watch Maratha forces methodically occupy the hills surrounding the village on all sides. They have not escaped to a refuge. They have locked themselves in an open-air tomb, handing their enemy the perfect tactical position for the final blow. It is then that Mahaji Shinde plays his final card, the move that seals the checkmate. From the heights overlooking Wadgaon, the British watch in horror as Maratha artillery crews begin to unlimber their guns. The situation is now strategically hopeless. They are trapped in a bowl, outnumbered, without supplies, and, most importantly, at the mercy of an enemy artillery that can bombard them at will without fear of an effective response. Any attempt to break the encirclement would be a massacre. Any attempt to resist would only prolong the agony before the inevitable annihilation. The game is over. The brilliance of Shinda's trap lies in its final simplicity. He has forced his enemy to choose the location of their own execution. The debate in the decimated British command is brief and grim. The evidence is overwhelming. The alternative to surrender is total, senseless annihilation. With the utmost humiliation, the white flag is raised. This is not the end of a glorious battle, but the ignominious collapse of an imperial expedition. The force that had marched out weeks before with supreme confidence, seeing itself as the vanguard of civilization, now surrenders unconditionally without having fought a single pitched battle. The defeat is absolute, not just on a military level, but on an ideological one. In the mud of Wadgaon, it was not merely 4,000 men who surrendered. It was the myth of British invincibility that was taken prisoner, stripped of its aura, and exposed as a fraud. The statistics of the carnage tell a misleading story if read superficially. Direct British combat casualties were relatively low, around 466 men, including 15 officers, killed or wounded during the chaotic retreat and final siege. But to reduce the outcome to this figure is to ignore the true scale of the disaster. The real number of the defeat is not 466, but the entire army. Nearly 4,000 soldiers, Europeans and sepoys alike, were forced to lay down their arms. It was not a defeat by attrition, but a strategic annihilation. Mahaji Shinde did not need to slaughter his enemies one by one. He simply left them with no options, stripped them of their will to fight, and forced them to admit their complete and irrevocable impotence. The Maratha victory was so overwhelming that it was achieved with an almost artistic economy of violence, making the British humiliation even more profound. The fate of the commanders was an epilogue of dishonor. Colonel Cockburn and the Civilian Committee, the architects of this calamity, were forced to sign the Treaty of Wadgaon, a document that was, in essence, a confession of their failure. Every clause was a thorn in the side of imperial pride, yet the humiliation did not end there. Upon returning to their own lines, their superiors in Calcutta, led by a furious Governor-General Warren Hastings, repudiated the treaty. They argued that the committee had no authority to sign such an agreement. While this saved the company from the worst long-term territorial consequences, it could not erase the stain. The surrender had happened. The myth of British martial superiority had been punctured, and the incompetence of its leadership exposed for the entire subcontinent to see. The immediate consequences for the captured soldiers were equally humiliating. They were disarmed and stripped of their equipment, their immaculate uniforms now filthy and torn, a reflection of their shattered pride. They were allowed to withdraw to Bombay, but their march back was not that of an army, but of a funeral procession for their own reputation. Every villager who watched them pass was a witness to the defeat of the Britait Sahib. For the Marathas, the spoils were immense. Not only did they recover all the weaponry, including the prized British artillery, but they also gained a propaganda victory of incalculable value. The news of Wadgaon spread throughout India like wildfire, inspiring other kingdoms and proving that the British lion, for all its roar, could be tamed and even caged. The Treaty of Wadgaon, though swiftly repudiated by the higher echelons of British power in Calcutta, sent a shockwave through the politics of the subcontinent. The most immediate and significant political consequence was the prolongation of the First Anglo-Maratha War. What the British had hoped would be a quick, decisive campaign to install their own puppet ruler turned into a long, costly, and bloody conflict that would last for several more years. The defeat at Wadgaon forced the East India Company to completely reevaluate its adversary. They could no longer dismiss the Marathas as a mere disorganized horde. They were forced to recognize them as a sophisticated power, capable of complex strategy and unconventional warfare. Arrogance was replaced by a grudging respect, fundamentally altering the power dynamic in India for a generation. On a strategic level, Wadgan was a brutal lesson for the British military. It exposed the critical vulnerabilities of their European model of warfare when applied blindly in a terrain and against an enemy that did not play by their rules. The reliance on long, heavy supply lines, the slow pace of movement due to artillery, and the inability to counter guerrilla tactics were revealed as near-fatal weaknesses. Although the British would eventually adapt their tactics in later conflicts, incorporating more light cavalry and improving their logistics, the lesson of Wadgan was seared into their institutional memory. It proved that technological superiority and battlefield discipline did not guarantee victory if the overarching strategy was flawed. Mahaji Shinde did not just defeat an army, he forced an empire to rewrite its war manual. For the Maratha Empire, the victory at Wadgan became a foundational myth, a moment of glory that would resonate throughout their history. It was the ultimate validation of their way of war and a potent symbol of their resistance against foreign invasion. Mahaji Shinde was elevated to the pantheon of national heroes, his name becoming synonymous with strategic cunning and military genius. The story was told and retold in ballads and chronicles, transforming into a legend of how intelligence, patience, and an intimate knowledge of one's own land could triumph over the brute force of a technologically superior imperial power. Wadgaon became a beacon of nationalist pride, a perpetual reminder that the Marathas, at their zenith, had brought the most powerful empire in the world to its knees. Ironically, the deconstruction of the British myth at Wadgan helped to build a new Maratha myth. However, this event also marked the zenith of Maratha unity and power. Although the war continued and the Marathas won further victories, the seeds of internal discord were already present. The brilliance of Wadgan was an act of collective genius that would be difficult to replicate as rivalries between the different Maratha chiefs began to erode their confederacy from within. Thus, the echo of Wadgan in history is bittersweet. It is, on one hand, the greatest example of Maratha strategic prowess and an indelible humiliation for the British Empire. On the other, it is a melancholy reminder of a potential that, due to future internal divisions, would never be fully realized, ultimately paving the way for the very British domination they had so brilliantly resisted. The Treaty of Wadgaon was a litany of imperial disgrace. The British were forced to relinquish all territories they had conquered since 1773, to halt their advance, and to guarantee safe passage for the defeated army. Every line of the document was an inversion of the power relationship they took for granted. But the true, enduring psychological genius of Mahaji Shinde was revealed in the final clause, one that transcended military strategy to strike at the very heart of British honor. The deepest humiliation was not written in ink, but in flesh and blood. The treaty demanded that the British leave two of their own men, a civilian named Mr. Farmer and a Lieutenant Stewart, as hostages. Their purpose: to ensure that the invincible East India Company would abide by the terms of its own surrender. This practice was not alien to Indian diplomacy, but for the colonial power that projected itself as the pinnacle of civilization and integrity, it was an existential poison. To leave hostages was an implicit and devastating admission. The word of the British Empire was not enough. Its honor was so unreliable that it had to be guaranteed by the freedom of two of its own subjects. The most powerful corporation in the world, the arm of a global power, was treated like an untrustworthy bandit who had to leave a bond to ensure his good behavior. This single clause dismantled the narrative of British moral superiority more effectively than any military defeat. At Wadgan, they were not just out-strategized, they were declared morally bankrupt, forced to pawn their own citizens as collateral for their broken word.